All right. Good evening, everyone. How's everyone doing? Awesome. So, I've been made aware that I am standing exactly between one presenter and wine tasting, hat making, chocolate. And so I'm going to try to make up some time. And in case I leave anyone with questions, I'll be at the wine tasting table tonight. But thank you for having me. I'm excited to talk about value realization. I have the pleasure of leading the enterprise experience technology group at Acuity Brands, and it's a talented group of people that apply technology in our supply chain, in our finance and corporate shared services spaces, so HR technology included. Value can be nebulous. So let's start this with a little bit of engagement. And let's see, in rapid fire, three people. Tell me what comes to mind in one word when I say value. Let's see, money. Okay. What's that? Customer. Okay. Definitely. End user, Chakri. That's right. The end user experience. So you're all right. And that highlights one of the, call it the first problems that, hold on one second, I don't think they gave me the clicker. Let me grab that and then I'll be back. Engaging. Right? And so ultimately, the value realization can be relative to any person as well as to businesses. And oftentimes that gets us into a cyclical process that makes it hard to identify what is value, was it created, and ultimately, did we realize it, right? And so value can refer to both tangible and intangible benefits that a business or a person invests expecting a return. And so problem one is value can mean different things to different people. And problem two is that value creation and value realization are not the same things. They're often confused to be the same thing, but they're not. And we'll talk a little bit about that as we get deeper in the presentation. So in order to help you understand the context of what value means to us at Acuity Brands, I'll give you a quick introduction to Acuity, our transformation journey, and ultimately we'll talk a little bit about our IBP and '09 value realization story. So Acuity Brands is a publicly traded industrial on the New York Stock Exchange. We see ourselves at the intersection of sustainability and technology. Our products, luminaires primarily, LED luminaires primarily, make a material impact on energy savings across the globe. And ultimately, we use technology to solve problems in spaces, in light, and more things to come, right? So we actively grow by acquisition. We have two major business segments, ABL, which makes about 75 to 80% of our revenues, and ISG is our IoT business that's a little bit smaller but growing aggressively. And ultimately, we are a values-based company that leverages our better, smarter, faster operating model that empowers 13,000 motivated associates to make a difference. Double-clicking a little bit into who we're really going to be talking about today is our Acuity Brands lighting group, the largest of our segments. And ABL ultimately has a legacy of deep brands that focus on luminaires and lighting, lighting controls, and components. And some of these brands are centuries old. Holophane, for instance, is a very old brand. Lithonia is getting close to that. But it has a very strong legacy in terms of the products that we bring to market. And ultimately, our strategy focuses on driving product vitality that enhances service to customers, and we are leveraging technology in order to create productivity and accelerate that flywheel continuously. And ultimately, we are striving to become a more scalable, repeatable, and predictable business. We go to market primarily through a segmented portfolio. I know we talked a little bit about business complexity. At any one time, we have 2 million SKUs and growing by 800 a day. But we are very targeted. Not all SKUs are the same for us. And so we have a contractor select model, which focuses on, call it, the products that need to be ready at the distributor's desk or at the retail shelf for the customer in real time. We have a design select portfolio that is focused on configurable products delivered at a very high service level. And ultimately, if you can dream it, Acuity can design it, build it, source it, and deliver it if you're willing to pay for it with our made-to-order process. All right, and so with that backdrop, let's talk a little bit about ABL's tech transformation journey and why '09 became relevant to our transformation. So lighting over the years has gone through many different phases. Who remembers incandescent light bulbs, the ones that look kind of orange, right? Yeah. Who remembers the compact fluorescent technology when it dropped and broke on your floor? There was this white powder all over the place. Yeah. But as of lately, over the last 15 years, we slowly started to see that go away, right? And Acuity was at the forefront of that transformation. And so when you think about what lighting was, it was essentially a bunch of sheet metal products bent into shape using very analog technology coming from many suppliers that you could easily get just in time or have dual sourcing strategies that work just fine, right? And for many years, that was okay. And we led the industry by being very responsive using that model. But as I said, the industry has evolved, the technology has evolved as we become more technology conscious, and we expect more from the hardware, right? So lighting now is just as complicated as a television or as consumer-grade electronics. And so what we've seen, Acuity has migrated from being just an assembler of lighting products to being an electronics industrial. And ultimately, we build our own components now. We're highly vertically integrated with the sensors, the LED boards, as well as the electronic drivers that go into these lighting fixtures. And so we started to compete for materials with electronic suppliers, Apple, Samsung, Tesla. All those components that go in those high-end electronics go into lighting fixtures today. And as a result, the way that we plan and the way that we operated our business needed to change. So that brought up the reason why we highlighted integrated business planning in order to unify a single plan where we can show up in the right way for our suppliers, for our customers, for increasing our associate productivity, and ultimately that we can create a unified plan that we can essentially create productivity through. Ultimately, what we were trying to do was create a better plan where we can minimize our variances, right? And in those variances is where we objectively saw we lost shareholder value, we lost time, and that's where you lose end user satisfaction. So whether it's above or below plan, it's still evil to us because that's where the losses occur. And so we wanted to become more precise. And by doing that, we ultimately focused on 3 key operational metrics as part of our transformation and planning journey that helped us become more resolute in terms of how should a top-end planning organization operate. Focused it on error percentage, we focused on plan bias, and we focused on mix accuracy. And we'll come back to mix accuracy because I'll give you a little bit of a secret. That's where the money is, at least for us. So what did we see after going down the journey? So a little bit of context. Acuity has deployed demand planning. We've deployed and certified supply planning, and we're in the process of configuring IBP currently. My team's not here today because they're busy doing that. I figured that was more important. But ultimately, the results that we've seen is that out of the box, '09 is better than our legacy systems in all of the places where our processes were ready. So, and when I say ready, it's the places where we immediately eliminated the human touch or needed for multiple touches. So while our planners used to spend the entire month filling out Excel sheets and getting the data ready. '09 lands the data ready for them to evaluate the plan and make decisions. And ultimately, what we saw was within our CNI group, or CNI channel, we saw mixed accuracy at the DSP, which is our revenue level, as well as our units forecast improved immediately. So much so that we were able to model that every 5% improvement in mixed accuracy was valued at $100 million in inventory for us. So the benefit conclusion from '09 was, we saw the power of the automation giving our planners time, made them more scalable, right? And I'll talk a little bit more about how scalable they became in a little bit. We saw that '09 delivered more consistent plans that allowed people to interact with their business partners and create and make decisions rather than manipulating data. And then ultimately, we saw that at the unit level, and at the general level, at the discrete levels of our planning levels, we saw a 3 to 4% improvement in terms of how things boiled up, right? And ultimately, when we looked across all of them, that was where we were seeing the 10% improvement. So, have we realized value? Are you sure? We're not done. So, oftentimes, identifying where the value is enough. At Acuity, it's not enough for us because value identified is not value realized, as I mentioned. Ultimately, we can't take a better plan to the bank or reinvest it or buy the next cool piece of technology with it or pay it out in bonuses to our associates that do an awesome job implementing '09. So we need to take it another step in order to convince leadership, convince stakeholders, convince shareholders that the value was created. And that's what we'll talk about. So let's talk about benefits realization. So on screen is a framework, and yes, I'll get into more detail at the wine bar, around how Acuity thinks about value realization. How does it start? It starts with value identification way before you even decide that '09 is the platform, as well as how do you select the platform, right? So we started with the business strategy and the IBP strategy. At Acuity, we think big picture and we think long-term scalability. These capital-intensive projects don't come along very often. They take a lot of effort, and you're placing a lot of bets with it. And ultimately, what we're trying to do is become very precise with the outcomes. So tying these large investments back to the business strategy is important. So technology hence becomes the enabler of initiatives that create long-term business value. The second step is creating that compelling investment thesis. And I said thesis because anyone can create a discounted cash flow model to show profitability, but creating an investment thesis means that you've taken a deep look at your assumptions and you've built a numeric and a quantitative-based analysis around your assumptions. And that's not easy to do. It takes time, it takes effort, and ultimately it's the key input that's going to create alignment in terms of what are you going to get out of what you're going to invest. So ultimately, you do want to get to a clear return on capital and net present value calculation. Notice I didn't say payback because really if it pays back in 1 year, you're not trying hard enough. And ultimately, for these long-term big investments, you need to think about scalability. And at Acuity, like I said, we think about the scalability of the platform long into the future. And so how did we do that? Like, how do you get these assumptions? Like, what are you talking about, Matt? So here's a layout of exactly one of the slides we took to our CEO because he likes to be involved in these technology things. And ultimately, like I said, we looked at our business strategy around IBP, and we looked at our value chain across suppliers, manufacturing, distribution, and customers. And then we pinpointed all the points where we saw value being created by our IBP and '09 technology journey. And where did we think it would show up? In revenue, operating expense improvements, asset productivity. Notice I didn't say asset efficiency. At Acuity, product efficiency is squeezing blood from a stone. Productivity is doing more with the same, thinking about scalability. And ultimately, we created a prioritized list of business case drivers that we could trace back to our end of period financials, right? Notice all of these benefit cases, there are some that are primary, some that are secondary. And even with the primary, some of those didn't make it into the final business case. Typically, you need 1, 2, or 3 in order to show that the juice is worth the squeeze. And that's what we did ultimately because it is traceable. From there, it's really detailing the people, process, and technology integration. So asking a hard question, what needs to be true about people, process, and technology to make those assumptions and value work? And only then can you be sure that you're creating sustainable value. The next part I call the integrity of the process, so the contingency planning and risk management. It's an important step to take a sober assessment because as much as we plan for things to go right, it often never does. And ultimately, it shows diligence in terms of pressure testing your assumptions. Ultimately, how does that show up in your plan? In a discounted cash flow model, it's going to show up as a change in timing. And that change in timing helps you understand when is your value going to show up. And ultimately, that's what you're going to be able to show if your assumptions are right, or even if they're wrong, does the benefit outweigh the risk that you're taking? And then really quickly, establishing quick metrics for success and value realization. I showed you how we looked at it from the operating level. That flows sequentially into the next step, which is how do you align that back to your end of period financials? And I'll show you how that worked out for us in the next slide. Like I said, not everything, mix accuracy could show up in many different ways. It could show up in cost of goods sold, it could show up in inventory, but ultimately you have to be able to trace it back to your financial statements in order to prove value realization. And then ultimately you need to maintain that alignment through a governance framework, right? So this one I call protecting against corporate amnesia, right? At the beginning of these projects, it's very exciting. Everybody's happy about the capital outlay. It's very optimistic. But 3 years down the road, like we are, 09's deployed. Who's counting anymore? Well, there is a group that's counting, and guess what? The business really owns the money back, right? So that partnership needs to continue. So having a very thorough governance process at different levels of the organization that keep value realization of the technology and the process front of mind is very important. So what has been Acuity's initial results from 09, right? So our investment thesis was pretty darn awesome, right? And like I mentioned, over 400% return on invested capital was forecasted, over 250% in internal rate of return, and we've already exceeded that 2.5 years in. And I'll let you know, the inventory target still was missed. So we're getting asked for more. So ultimately, how did it show up? It showed up in our inter-period financials. So it came from gross margins. We saw over 400% basis point improvement over the course of 3 years. And being a publicly traded company, you don't have to take my word for it. You could check our financials online and see the contribution. And ultimately, 20 days of inventory improvement over the course of 3 years. Call it big numbers for us, that's over $200 million worth of working capital that got reallocated. So essentially, 09 and IBP paid for our entire technology roadmap for 5 years. The next one is very important to us. So we talk about associate productivity and associate experience at Acuity. So I mentioned the thought about scalability. More with the same is our view of productivity. So we had 8 people across our planning orgs when we first started this. And ultimately, based on layering technology that enables process, we were able to track that based on the changes that we've made to the process today, if we were to do that in our legacy systems, that would have been the equivalent of 26 full-time employees doing that same process with a manual tool. And so ultimately, when you're looking at, did we make people's lives better? We absolutely did. And ultimately, Acuity wants to be the best place where the best people come to do their best work. That's a lot of bests. And then ultimately, how does this matter for end user experience, right? So our customer experience metrics, our on-time metrics have improved over 20% over the course of that 3 years. Even during the pandemic, Acuity was the lighting manufacturer that distributors trusted and wanted to come to in order to supply their products because nobody else could. So with the power of IBP and '09, Acuity has shown that it can make a difference. And ultimately, what we're trying to do is make good decisions over the long term, think about scalability, and by being methodical about our framework of how we approach value, you can really make a difference. And if what I'm going to leave you with is one thing, value realization is not the same thing as value creation. So ultimately, it's worth the diligence, and hope you guys have a great rest of the afternoon, and I'll be looking forward to having a Cabernet with a lot of you.